My name is Natalie Cheng, Anak Enta, and today I'll be presenting on what is gross domestic product. So, let's start with national income. National income is about accumulated money value of all final goods and services produced in a country during one financial year. The computations of national income will indicate a country's economy's overall health performance, if it's thriving or simply deteriorating. So, why is it important? First, setting economic policy. National income output can help economies in formulating economic policies for economic development. Second, budget preparations. Budget of a country is highly dependent on the net national income and its concepts. The government formulates the yearly budget with the help of national income statistics in order to avoid any cynical policies. Third, standard of living. National income data assists the government in comparing the standard of living amongst countries and people living in the same country at the same time. Last but not least, defense and developments. National income estimates help us to separate the national product between defense and development purposes of the country. From such figures, we can easily know how much can be set aside for the defense budget. So GDP is a tool of statistics to determine how the economy has grown by measuring the value of the nation output. Simply said, gross domestic product GDP can be defined as the total value of everything produced within a country's borders. When the economist is talking about the size of the economy, they are referring to GDP. Next will be presented by Mohamad Izzat.
The GDP measures two things at once. First, the total income of everyone in the economy, especially in a country. Second, the total expenditure on the economy's output of goods and services. The GDP indicates the wealth of a country, whether the wealth is growing or not, tax revenue and government borrowing, levels of employment and unemployment, and the consumer spending, investment, and the international trade. GDP is calculated by using the expenditure and income totals in the circular flow of expenditure and income. The next slide I will explain about the circular flow of income. The circular flow of income shows the flows of money around the economy. It involves four sectors: households, firms, government, and international. Look at the red arrow from firms to households. It means households receive income for their services, and look at the red arrow from households to firms, which means households buys the output of firms for consumption. Now look at the blue arrows from households to firms, which means firms hire land, labor, and capital to produce goods and services. You can see the blue arrow from the firms to households. That means firms produce goods and services to the households, which firms pay wages for them, for households. Next, firm receive the payment from the governments. Firm invest in new producer goods. Next is if you see the green arrow from households and firms to the government, it means government collect taxes. Government collect tax from households and firms to fund spending on public services. And last, international. Imports means the country buy overseas products, and exports means overseas economies buy the country's product. There are some methods how to compute GDP. First, using the expenditure approach. The total amount of expenditure taking place in the economy, that is aggregate demand. GDP, how to get GDP? Consumption plus investment plus government purchase plus net exports. The next method is by using the income approach, which means the sum of factor incomes, that is the total income generated through the production of goods and services. how to get GDP, wage and salaries plus rent plus profits plus net interest plus dividends. And the last method is by using the output approach. That is the total value of the output of goods and services produced in the country.
Next, we move to the GDP trend from 2011 until 2020 with major issues that affect the annual GDP with examples of developed and developing countries. The GDP growth in Malaysia fluctuates from 2011 to 2020. So I want to focus on 2014 and 2020 as these years are the major increase and the major fall in GDP growth in Malaysia. The percentage of GDP growth in 2014 is 6.01%. The sectors that contributed to this major increase is services sector, mining and quarrying sector, and manufacturing sector. The services sector rise to 6.4% in fourth quarter compared to 6.2% in third quarter of 2014. It is contributed by the growth in wholesale and retail trade. Next, in third quarter of 2014, mining and quarrying sector only showed 1.4%, but it showed a rapid growth of 9.6% in fourth quarter. This strong performance reflected by the double-digit growth in production of crude oil and then turnaround in natural gas. Lastly, the manufacturing sector grew 5.2% in fourth quarter, driven by the electrical and electronic products.
We can compare this situation with Germany. For Germany, the annual GDP in 2014 has increased from 2.21 compared to 4.38 in 2013. During that period, the manufacturing sector is struggling, but the GDP managed to grow. One of the factors is due to the cheaper oil prices that helps the manufacturing sector to be able to increase output levels and operation margin since the transportation costs decrease. For Iran, the annual GDP in 2014 increases from negative 0.194 in 2013 to 4.603. The increases are because of the increase in exportation of oil from Japan, China, Korea, India, and Turkey. In the fourth quarter, Japan has increased to 46% of exporting oil, while South Korea has 7% increasement. Natural gas also has increased of 8% exportation compared to exportation in 2013.
Next, we continue to the year of 2020, which the economic growth is slowed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. It involves many sectors that cannot operate normally because they have to undergo the movement control order made by the government to prevent the virus from spreading. Most of the sectors in Malaysia having a negative growth in 2020. This is because of COVID-19. But there is one sector that maintained a positive growth at 3.0%, which is manufacturing sector.
In Bahrain, the GDP of 2020 also experienced a decrease, which is negative 5.085 compared to 2.141 in 2013. The fall in GDP are because of the drop in oil sector from 1.7% to negative 13% and also the seasonal maintenance on the offshore Abu Sa'afah oil field. The natural and associated gas supply also has decreased to 10.7%. Since oil sector contributed to 70.7% of GDP in 2014, the drop in oil sector thus gives a big effect in Bahrain GDP. For Brunei, the drop in annual GDP is not as large margin as Bahrain, with the decrease from 3.869 in 2013 to 1.134 in 2014 due to the decline output of crude oil and reduce in natural gas production. The drop is due to the limited on-site workforce to comply to the restrictions of COVID-19. The world's transition towards a cleaner energy source also affect the drop in production of oil sector.
Hello, Assalamualaikum. My name is Mohamad Addin bin Mohamad Salleh, and today I would like to explain about statistical data for Malaysia's GDP, which is Gross Domestic Product in 2021. So, GDP measures of national income and output for a given country's economy. The gross domestic product, which is GDP, is equal to the total expenditures for all final goods and services within the country in a stipulated period of time. So, this is a statistical data on year 2021 for Malaysia's GDP. So, As stated in the diagram below, Malaysia's GDP declined by 4.5% in the third quarter in 2021. On a seasonally adjusted quarter-on-quarter basis, GDP declined by 3.6% in the third quarter in 2021. These are the activities across all economic sectors in Malaysia for the third quarter in 2021. So, the GDP for services has decreased by negative 4.9% in the third quarter compared to second quarter, which is 35%. It is because of weaker consumer-related activities. For the GDP for construction, also decreased by negative 20%, negative 20.6% in third quarter compared to the second quarter, which is 40.3%. The reason is limits on operating capacity. The next is the GDP for mining also decreased by negative 3.6% in the third quarter compared to the second quarter, which is 13.9%. The reason is lower crude oil and natural gas production in middle of maintenance closures. So, for the investment and imposition of containment measures, the GDP in private investment has decreased by negative 4.8% in the third quarter compared to the second quarter, which is 17.4%. The reason is the lower structures investment due to limited operating capacity. For the GDP in public investment, were decreased by negative 38.9% in the third quarter compared to the second quarter, which is 12%. The reason also near the same. It is because of lower investment by government and public corporations. And lastly, for the GDP in net exports also decreased by negative 37.5% in the third quarter compared to the second quarter, which is 34.3%. It is because of growth in imports has outpaced exports. So that's all for me. Thank you.
We have covered what is GDP to the statistic data in our countries as well as other countries. As of now, it is clear that COVID-19 pandemic 2020 recessions has major impact on most economies to lose at least 2.9% of their GDP over 2020. But the rebound is expected and most of the countries are now on track for strong growth, including Malaysia, cited from the World Group 2021. Malaysia's gross domestic product GDP is projected to grow by 6.2% in 2022. To conclude our presentations today, GDP is an important measurement and very much relevant for one country. The representations of economic productions and growth will have a large impact on everyone within a given economy.